This is Gerald Everett Jones, host of GetPublished Radio. In this special episode, recorded in the aftermath of South African unrest in July of 2021, the Michelle Benjamin Foundation hosts a dialogue between South African commentator Joanne Joseph and me. Joanne is an anchorwoman, radio journalist, and best-selling author. We discuss conditions in South Africa as well as in the United States and in Kenya, the setting of my new book, Harambee's Kenyan Sundowner. South African publisher Michelle Benjamin hosts this show.
So Joanne and Gerald, you may go ahead and have the discussion. Thank you.
Mish, thank you so much for giving us the background there and sharing some of the angst that's been felt in the country over the last few days. And Gerald, I want to bring you into the conversation here because I'm just curious to know, we didn't get the sense at first that this was being reported on widely in the United States. Many of our friends were being informed by our personal reports online or on social media of what was going on. How has the story been covered in the US press, Gerald?
It's been something on the back pages, as it were, and actually I get the standard from Kenya that I'm now reading on pretty much a daily basis, and I saw that at the outbreak in South Africa, the article was on page 5 of the standard. And it reported, as did, and it harmonized pretty much with what I saw in the New York Times, that they reported that some 70 people had been killed and many more injured. But you know, we're also, during the same week, we're getting the news from Haiti of the assassination and the unrest there. We're getting the news from Cuba and the unrest there, which seems to be of not quite the same political motivation. But what strikes me about all of this is what in the military, actually, they call situational awareness. And I think that that's really something that as citizens of the world, we must be very thoughtful about. During World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said famously, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. What is being promulgated here throughout the world is fear. This is the biggest danger. And my feeling is, and I'm not sure that I understand this totally, and I'm not sure who does, but I firmly believe from what I've seen, both in Kenya and here, and now from what I'm seeing unfold there and in other parts of the world, is it seems to, at its very roots, come down to cybercrime and social media manipulation, what you would call social engineering. The purpose of cybercrime, you may think it's, to blackmail you if your database is down, or perhaps to shut off this pipeline, or perhaps to shut down your banking system or your water system. No. The purpose of cybercrime, international cybercrime, is to instill fear, widespread fear. And from fear comes social manipulation such that it does two things. It is designed to undermine faith in democracy and to set neighbor against neighbor. Your enemy is your neighbor. Your enemy is the press. Your enemy are the people that you used to trust that surround you. So I've seen, and that's actually one of the things that that I felt so strongly about in writing my book, which is basically about a middle-aged white person who goes to Kenya as a tourist and is something of a passive observer and not really involved, and yet becomes more and more and more involved to the point that he finally has to take action. And it's like being in, say, France in World War II, and you see it coming and you see it coming, you see it coming. And Albert Camus finally gave up and said, you have to put your hands in the dirt. You have to take action, okay? But this needs to be thoughtful, because the people who are causing, I don't know a great deal about what's going on in Durban, but of the people who are fomenting that violence, the instigators are probably not looters. I mean, I saw this happen in a peaceful demonstration in Santa Monica. It began as a peaceful demonstration against police violence, victimization of racial minorities, which is a perfectly legitimate peaceful protest. It had what, 100,000 people had a big gathering, and then suddenly it all turned violent. Okay, now who were those agitators? I don't know. I do know that I saw the same scenes happening on video that were actually happening a few blocks from my house, the same that Michelle described, where there would be a Mercedes with 6 fellows inside, pull up outside the store that sells the expensive running shoes, and they ran in, they broke the windows, they grabbed as many boxes of shoes, threw them in the trunk, and sped off. Now, this is a gang. These are criminals, but these people are taking advantage of a situation that actually begins and is instigated by political unrest and dissatisfaction. And it's an irony, a huge irony in South Africa, that the root cause seems to have to do with this, with this very righteous, if you will, investigation of corruption, and what a person presumed to be a bad actor has been sent to prison, and yet somehow this rebellion is being cast in the as if he were some righteous person who's being unfairly imprisoned. Okay, I don't know the facts of that, but what I do know is that any dialogue that has to do with the fact that it is one race or one another, one class or one another that is responsible, that's the desired result, because you have to, that's the desired result of whoever is fomenting it, because the objective, as I believe it is all over the world, is for the autocrats, if you want to call them that, the oligarchs, the people who really care primarily about power. And we saw that, again, we saw this during World War II. We saw power-hungry people who had no principles whatever. Now, I do also believe that as responsible citizens, I say my wife and I came back, she was working in wildlife conservation and child welfare, and we were there for better part of 2 years. And we came back right before COVID, and I often joked with people. I said, well, we came back because things in Kenya got interesting. Well, of course, when we came back, things here got so much more interesting. Okay. And one of the things I felt was, again, as my character in the story, I began to think more like a Kenyan. Okay. I began to see corruption and it wasn't that the corruption in my country was new. It had been there all along, but it had been somewhat varnished over. It's like, oh, where we find corruption, we'll wipe it out. Okay, well, it's not like, so there's this American exceptionalism. It's everybody should be like us. Well, I certainly, based on the last few years, I don't think everybody should be like us. So, and I often think if we'd had a parliamentary system during all this, we probably would have kicked the fellow out much earlier and gotten on with life. So that's how I feel about it, is that the instability, but then again, multinationals, we want to point fingers at them, but actually multinationals want stability. They're eager to pay whatever bribe is necessary just simply to stay in business. So it's not one way or the other. I don't know that this is, I can't really blame this on globalization, but I can say that it is a worldwide problem. And I suspect that the bad actors are, yes, they use the techniques of criminals, but I do think that destabilizing democracies really is at the fundamental part of it. And if we are to persist as democracies and as responsible citizens, I think we do have to think Kenyan in a way that, your way forward probably has something to do with confronting corruption, but perhaps also in some ways understanding how to live with it and work within it to reform wherever you're going, because you can't, because if you tear your country apart, it's going to take a decade to build it back. And meanwhile, you and your family are going to suffer. And, so I don't want to be a Luddite and say I'm not in favor of technology or improvements or social media or anything like that. But I do want to argue in the cause of thoughtfulness, of as I say, situational awareness, and the immediate reaction to, oh my God, they are doing this, and in whatever label they are, look behind that and keep asking yourself, who is it who benefits? Because, I mean, Michelle says, well, tell the world about it. Well, I'll say one thing. One of the things that's going on in this country, besides a huge congressional appropriation for infrastructure and welfare that's as big as anything we spent in World War II, that's top of mind here. So that's one of the things that's pushing your story back. But the other thing is, by the end of the summer, every American soldier is supposed to be out of Afghanistan, the longest engagement in our history, which seemed to have almost no point. Okay, well, if you think that the US military is going to rush into any other part of the world to help out, number one, I'm not sure you want it, but number two, it's not going to happen. Yeah. And if we're talking about the United Nations peacekeepers, if you're familiar with the way they do business, United Nations peacekeepers usually are there when there's a peace to keep. Okay, they're not dealing with insurgents or revolutionaries or whatever, or engaging them in firefights. They're simply entrenched in a community to make sure that there is no outbreak. So that is a very big distinction into, it's not like they are going to rescue Cuba or Haiti or South Africa or anywhere else.
Yeah. Gerald, I want to ask you about this issue of corruption. And it's interesting to me because you say you've internalized the very Kenyan perspective, really, of corruption. And so you have this kind of hybridized way of looking at it, which I think is fairly intriguing to me. And that's for a couple of reasons, because you've got the view of the outsider, in inverted commas, but you've been in Kenya for long enough to kind of internalize the way people there think and to actually start thinking like them and seeing the world from their perspective. How do you make sense of this? I mean, one gets the sense here in South Africa that there's a group of people very opposed to corruption, and it's very black and white for this group of people, saying, well, we've got X number of really poor people in our country who require development. Jacob Zuma and his cronies, all indications are that he, together with the Guptas, have eaten up billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of our income and our state revenue. Therefore, we've not been able to provide for the poor. We've not been able to guarantee the promised equality in this country. And therefore, Jacob Zuma deserves to go to jail. He deserves to be put on trial, and he deserves to go to jail if he's found guilty. And then you've got another group that is torn. And I don't know whether this is a cultural thing or this is something that harks back to the past, where you had chieftains, for example, where this idea of our turn to eat at the trough is an acceptable thing, because these are struggle heroes. They were deeply deprived of years of freedom for the liberation struggle they fought. They spent a good deal of time in prison away from their families. And there's a feeling among certain people that the sacrifices they made have entitled them to a certain amount of reward, shall we say, even if it is at the expense of the country's citizens. And I don't quite know how those two schools of thought ought to be reconciled, or whether we can simply say, it's a very romanticized idea of how one should deal with with freedom fighters, whether we ought to have a special code of conduct for them that allows them certain privileges that the rest of the population is not allowed in a democracy? Or do we say, no, it's black and white. You cannot steal from the state and you cannot steal from the poor in your country.
Well, I don't know. Black and white, of course, is an unfortunate way of characterizing it from the standpoint of race relations, because that one of the things that struck me was that I think among my readers here in the United States, and certainly some in Europe, and this is actually one of the things that my marketing team and my publicists have discussed with me, is beware of readers, woke readers, if you will, and I consider myself a progressive, but beware of woke readers in the United States who will be offended that you are presuming to talk about African race relations. And that was not the purpose of my book. I mean, certainly my main character simply, I recorded the things that happened to me and the things that Kenyans related to me. Okay. And some of them are stereotypical, some of them are racist, and they are what they are. Okay. And it's not advocating anything, but one of the things that I found that just struck me very powerfully was, as a white person attempting to settle into Kenyan society there on the South Coast in this small town, I assumed that there would be certain kinds of prejudices. There weren't. Okay, the black and white relations are not at the core of the daily struggles of Kenyans. The daily struggles of Kenyans are centered on the strife among the 43 different ethnic societies, or tribes, if you will, and the three tribes that basically have run the country since independence. And the corruption is really centered there. And it's our turn to eat famously has been said to have been a quote by one of the prior Kenyan presidents, when and it was one of the very first things I heard when I came to Africa. Was I was taking the ferry, Mombasa, you fly into Mombasa, but it's an island. So, there are bridges on the north to get you to the suburbs in the north, but I had to get to the South Coast, which is where we were going to live. And you have to take the ferry. Okay, so this is a car ferry, and there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of people on the ferry. And the driver who was taking us across said, the Japanese, and actually at the time we were going across on the ferry, we were almost sideswiped by a big super tanker. Okay, because coming in and out of the port. And I said, how often does this happen? They said, oh, well, it's a problem. It's a perpetual problem. And there have been ferries swamped and whatever. But he said, the Japanese gave us some huge amount of money to build a bridge, because they didn't want their boats to conflict with, they didn't want to be responsible. And apparently, not only did the bridge never get built, but the president at the time said, it is our turn to eat. So, and this is, if you are on the Serengeti, and it is the migration season, and you look, as I would see wildebeest and zebra as far as the eye could see, thousands upon thousands of animals grazing there on the plain. And then, that here come the lion and the cheetah, and the driver says to you, the safari guide says, it is their time to feed. Well, actually, a Kenyan understands it in a different way, because that migration is seasonal, and during the time when there are no animals there, or when it's been overgrazed, or when it's during drought, those predators are starving. Okay, so one can understand the mindset of, we must take when we have it. When it comes into our hands, we can't just give it away. So we can understand that philosophy. But I do believe that corruption in a way is, it's like being in church or synagogue or mosque and asking yourself the fundamental question of human behavior: why is there evil in the world? And the best, and I've certainly struggled with this most of my life, is the best explanation I've heard is in a Leonard Cohen lyric. And he says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And when you think about it, if there were no evil, and I'm not saying that it's blessed or that it's intended to be or that everything works out the way it's supposed to, I can't really go there. But I can say that if there were only righteousness, if there were only good on a daily basis, that innovation, disruption, because now actually in technology, we're using innovation and disruption as synonyms. Okay, whereas what you're experiencing now in South Africa is disruption in its most fearful form. Okay, but what is it that's going to come next? And it really, if it's going to grow from disruption, it must be somehow creative, innovative, infused with a vision of what we want. But it can't just, if you can't just have the mindset, we're going to take everybody who we think is corrupt and line them up against a wall and shoot them. That's been done. That's Fidel Castro in Cuba. Okay. And yet that society had a great deal of stability for very long. And yet, there were plenty of Cubans who wanted out of there in the worst possible way. So I do believe, and coming back to it, that I won't say that we need to make our peace with corruption, but I will say, Kenyans will say, almost like a national motto, corruption's the mother of Kenya. It's like every taxi driver, every tuk-tuk driver, every waiter, every barman, they're going to repeat. It must have been repeated to me 50 times. And they will say it to you as though it's like air, it's like breathing, it's just the way it is. And a Kenyan journalist who read my book, and he had done some fact checking for me, responded. He said, the Kenyan national elections are coming up in August of 2022. It's very possible that some of our passive Kenyans may take some inspiration from your main character who finally decides to act. And I thought, oh my, I certainly did not write this book with the intention of preaching to Kenyans what they should do in their election. I don't want to be just one more white guy who shows up in Africa and says, I'll change everything, because I don't know what to do. But if it were, spoiler alert, okay, the thing that really, and this happened during COVID, so I mean, you can't really separate things that are happening. One of the things that infuriated me, as it did my main character, was I read in a Kenyan news release that 20,000, as a result of COVID, 20,000 teenage children in foster care were going to be returned to their homes. And I thought to myself, and this was a government policy, and I thought to myself, return to their homes. Well, wait a minute. The reason they're in foster care is they have no homes. Okay, they're going to be returned to the grandparents who can't support them, can't discipline them. They're going to be returned to the abusive father who raped her. They're going to be returned to the roving gang that two of whom actually did attack me right near Kibera in Nairobi, and I could have been mugged at Central Park in New York. I don't know that it was a different. I'm not characterizing that. I'm just saying that if you're going to take 20,000 teenagers in Nairobi and turn them loose on the street, that sounds like. And they said, oh, we can't do social distancing. We can't feed them properly. But it sounds also like the government is saying, well, the money that we're using for those foster care facilities, perhaps we can eat that too. And one of the discussions that's going on in Kenya these days is the Building Bridges Initiative, which is a constitutional reform initiative, is operating in parallel. It's something of a horse race with the national election nominations. Okay, and there's some who say we must reform the Constitution before we can have the elections. There are others say, no, we must have the elections and adhere to whatever Constitution is in place on that day. Now, the Kenyan Constitution says The only reason you could ever postpone the election by even a day would be if the country's at war. So what are these geniuses saying? COVID-19 is a war. We might as well just stay in power. How's this going to play out? Okay. So these are tensions that are building there. And, you know, the year before my wife and I took up residence in Kenya, there had been a contested election. The head of the bureau that was doing the computer counting was found murdered. And there was an alternative swearing in ceremony by the fellow who felt that he had actually won the election. And there was some violence connected with that. But he was brought into the government. And then actually, while I was there, it was about a year and a half later, there were he and the president shaking hands, new parliamentary coalition government. But coincidentally, it was the day after the United States Secretary of State had been there, the new Secretary of State on a visit. And I thought, I pictured this scene in my mind, and him opening his checkbook and saying, you know, what's it going to take for you guys to settle down? And this particular Secretary of State had been the CEO of one of the oil companies and of one of the most, my dad was in the oil business. He didn't like that particular company very much, but he said that they were the most unscrupulous. That's probably gossip. I don't know. But if there's anybody who knows how to pay a bribe, it would be the CEO of an international bribe on the order of millions or billions. It would be someone like that. So did that keep the peace? Very probably. Did that promise infrastructure development for Kenya in terms of the solar power farm that had never been hooked up to the power grid, or the road in Mombasa that leads nowhere, that has never been finished? It might help those things. But is that money that a big chunk of it might have gone into the pockets of bureaucrats? Yes, that's also possibly true.
Gerald, that's deeply unsettling for me. And I think many Africans watching this will say to you, well, clearly we do not do enough to hold our leaders to account. But I want to tackle a last issue.
I don't think we do enough either.
Yeah.
I don't
yeah,
think
yeah,
we
no,
do
and that's
either.
probably true all over the world, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to tackle this last issue with you simply because we're short of time and we need to wrap shortly, but it's something really important because I think our countries are on a parallel trajectory when it comes to this issue of race relations. We're fighting the same sort of demons in regard to this. In South Africa, we talk about reconciliation. We've coined this idea around rainbowism, which was a kind of false sense of conciliation or reconciliation following apartheid. Indeed, there was the will during Nelson Mandela's time to unite the country, to unite the races in the country, but the hard work of dialogue, of working through the atrocities that were committed on a large scale, the kind of dialogue that was required at a grassroots level among ordinary people who could not exorcise their traumatic past, has left people with this hangover, this trauma that has lasted another 30 years almost without any kind of resolution. And on top of that, inequality has compounded the reality of that. And so there's trauma, there's tragedy, there's a concoction of that anger fits into as well. And frustration, particularly if you're a young person in South Africa without a future because of what has been offered up to you by my generation and the generation that precedes me. But clearly we need to be talking because we cannot be speaking with our fists. We need to be reaching each other in an empathetic kind of way. And clearly those are the same kinds of conversations that ought to be taking place in the United States and other places in the world that are experiencing these racial fractiousness among different groups. Can you give me a sense of, do you have any ideas around how we ought to be dialoguing as a nation around it? In what spaces ought this to take place? Is it possible? Is it a pipe dream?
That's an ongoing conversation, certainly here. And as I say, one of the things that struck me is that the conversation from one country to the other is possibly of a different character. And I think we shouldn't assume that what's going on locally in terms of factional differences, be they Muslim and Christian, be they white and black, be they, I understand from, actually, I just recently read a book by Rwandan called An Eternal Audience of One, about a coming of age story of a young black man from Rwanda who went to school as an attorney to study law in Cape Town. And he pointed out that he felt more discriminated against than many of the whites there. That in that particular part of South Africa, that if you were black and from some other part of Africa, you were foreign. And he felt that very severely. There were certain clubs that he couldn't go into as a party goer, as a young college student, where there were whites and there were South Africans. And he was and in the book, he's actually dating a white woman from Johannesburg, and that's not the issue with his family. The issue with his family is, why aren't we, as Rwandans, being honored as citizens of Namibia? They went to Namibia and then they went to South Africa. So those distinctions are different. Those are localized. And we've been having this debate in the United States, especially over the last couple of years, about what you would call rainbowism. There was this idea of, until more recent events, there was a dialogue around, and even government policies around, color blindness. Okay, the idea that, okay, then there were also initiatives that have been on the books for quite a long time, affirmative action, where yes, we will be colorblind, we'll look at qualifications, but we're also going to have quotas so that we're going to make up for discrimination in the past. Okay, now there's ongoing discussion about reparations for slavery, which is, an incredibly complex debate, alongside the idea that some of the social programs that have been recently proposed are so huge in terms of expenditure. Like I said, the 3.5 trillion is just shy of the 4 trillion that we spent in World War II, although there's a difference in inflation in money, but that very initiative has to do with building up what we would call the underclass and helping close the gaps between rich and poor. We're not attempting to flood people with income that discourages them from actually productive jobs. But then again, we've got to have some kind of safety net so that people don't just starve. And that's true here. And you would think that would be an impossibility in a place as wealthy as the United States. And yet, we can waste billions upon billions of dollars that we had on an expensive aircraft that we decided we just didn't want. And, in an era with international cybercrime, why would you throw your money at building big metal objects that take, billions of, if you want a U.S. aircraft carrier to help you out, it'll be a week before they get there. Okay. But if you're under cyber attack, you need help tomorrow. Okay. So where should we put our money? What kind of world are we living in? So I think it's a false sense of security to say, oh, well, we have all these wonderful armaments, we can keep the peace, we'll be the peacekeepers of the world. That's a delusion. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. So I do think that the recent debate here has been about how can we celebrate and appreciate and even teach differences and be factual about it, which of course is a huge debate, and yet still have a dialogue and still have mutual respect. And what it might seem like a cop-out, but I would say one of the things that may help us more than anything is literature. Is teaching a generation to read. And I'm fond of talking about the psychiatrist Milton Erickson, he's passed away now, but he actually implemented psychiatric cures through storytelling. And, someone would come to him and present a problem or an issue, and he would tell them a story that seemed completely irrelevant. And they would go away. And Erickson's belief was that a story, once you think you've forgotten it, is much more powerful on your future behavior. And that's because the censoring mind, the mind that makes judgments about, oh, well, that can't be true, or I'm not like that, or, this doesn't have anything to do with me. When that mind gets out of the way, the subconscious mind has the ability to act spontaneously and without reservation. And what I've often said to writers groups is, all right, let's see, what were we taught in school? Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, Great Expectations. Who can tell me the plot of any one of those? And blank. And yet I submit to them, whatever it was that you were taught in school, whatever literature it was that was brought to you, I submit to you, these are forgotten stories, and they are part of your subconscious. You cannot help but act according to whatever morality, lessons learned, and it was the French writer Stendhal in, I think it was 1814, who said that, oh, well, the people who live in Paris are wiser than the people who live in the country. And of course, that seemed outrageous. And yet he said, no, they read novels. They read novels about sex scandals, and they know the consequences of bad behavior. And he said that the people in the country, all they have is their Bible lessons, and they never listen to those. But the consequences of bad behavior, he said, well, that doesn't make them any more righteous, because they just find more clever ways to hide their scandals. But seriously, I do think that the way we're taught and the way that we, again, they say with a child, physical discipline, it goes only so far. I mean, maybe with a very young child who really can't respond to verbal commands at all, but especially among tweens and teens, moral authority, moral persuasion, your life as a model is so much more important than anything you might tell them to say. Go to your room and no video games for an hour, whatever. No, but they're looking at you and studying how well your life has delivered happiness, love, warmth, bonding, relationships, support. If they need support and you happen to, well, I can't tonight, I've got this meeting, or, again, what can you do for someone who just lost a loved one? Maybe almost nothing, but actually sitting in the same room with them, giving them your time, the presence of your body, that's incredibly powerful and not to be underestimated. So I don't know whether that's a good answer. It's the only answer I have.
I don't think there's a right answer there, Gerald. I think as societies and as writers within these societies, that these are the sorts of ideas we need to start considering. And certainly your ideas around literature, they grab me as being one of the most powerful ways of harnessing empathy in societies, because there it is, capture a story of someone else's life, subjectivities that you would never yourself have experienced or understood are there on the page. And there a writer has given you a window into that unique experience. And there's such power in that. So Gerald, thank you so much for your insights into this.
Thank you for having me. Really, I'm being generous with your listening.
Of course, and of course, we look forward to seeing your book on the shelves in early August this year. And certainly, many of our viewers this evening who are not familiar with your work, Michelle Benjamin, who is going to be publishing the book under Line e-publishing, is also going to make hard copies available at certain exclusive bookstores.
Well, the ebooks are also out there. They're out in EPUB and Kindle. I mean, so not to say anything against paperbacks, which I believe it's always nice to hold a book in your hand, but the book is available right now online everywhere in the world.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. And just give us the title again, Harambee's
Harambee's Kenyan
Sundowner.
Sundowner, and I had debated with that last word, his madness, his sunset, and, it is late in his life. He's a widower. And then I thought about the image of the sundowner. It's the end of the day. You've had a day on safari, and your crew sets up a table with a linen tablecloth on a hilltop, and you watch the sky turn colors that you've never seen before, and you watch the animals slowly migrate toward the water hole that's right beneath you. There's nothing more special than that. And yet, again, we're talking about the sunset of life. In equatorial Africa, when the sun goes down, it's dark. And you appreciate, I had to appreciate this light while I had it, because it is it's night now.
Gerald, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of those thoughts
Joanne.
with us, also giving us a little bit of a taste of what's in your book. And Michelle Benjamin, thank you so much for inviting the both of us to be part of this discussion.
And Joanne, before we say goodnight, you're also writing the book, and if you could just give us a backdrop about, if you can, about what your book is about and how it can bring healing and reconciliation in our country and the world, not just South Africa, the world.
So thank you for acknowledging that, Michelle. It's still a work in progress. We're in the midst of a final edit at the moment, but it is a story about a young woman who becomes an indentured laborer in South Africa. She is from 19th century India and finds herself in South Africa. I'm not going to give you too many spoilers because the book is quite loaded in terms of plotting, but essentially it's a part of our history that's been hidden by a kind of blind spot, or in a blind spot, I should say. We know large chunks of South Africa's history, and some of them remain hidden. I think, periods of slavery and so forth are starting to come to light through the great academic writing around that. However, indenture is something that has remained in the darkness for a long time. South Africans of Indian descent don't even know the history. We don't know the intricate histories of our ancestry in this country. We do not know about the human rights abuses and the atrocities that marked that period, nor do we have a really good understanding of how Indo-African relations have become so tense over the centuries. And so this, for me, was an opportunity to explore those themes and hopefully to bring to light an era that has largely been ignored in literature, that's been marginalized and not really been brought into the South African mainstream canon in any particular way. So I'm hoping that the book will have a couple of consequences, positive consequences, that is, to give South Africans and others outside of South Africa a sense of the indentured story that took place here over the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of 50 years. But I'm also hoping that we'll be able to deal with some of the aspects of our past, our racialized past, our classist past, that have come through, that have filtered through into our lives today. And we can ask ourselves questions, hopefully, having read this kind of text, about whether it's right that 160 years ago, there were people who were living in a particular way, a deeply deprived way of living. And in modern day South Africa, we have much the same situation. We've got echoes of that in the way that our Black majority lives. Can that be right? Can we condone it? Can we allow it to be perpetuated in this country? How are we going to change it? Not just here, but in all places in the world where inequality exists.
Thank you, Joanne. That was very insightful. And thank you, Gerald. I think that both of you, being such accomplished writers, published authors, you have both in your way just given the message tonight, which is the ethos of the Michelle Benjamin Foundation. And the message that stands out for me is this: compassion and kindness to heal the world. And I hear that through writing, through your experiences, because I do believe that our experiences, especially when it's filtered through writing and through visual art or music, however however we explore our creativity, I believe, my personal belief is that within and therein is the secret to saving humanity, not just one country, but humanity at large. And I cannot understand why creativity is so neglected in schools. I think it's the one area that we should actually spend more time on, especially with our younger children, because it can save how we think, how we plan, how we motivate ourselves, which can change the world. So I hear that coming from the two of you as writers. Always very interesting to hear authors speak. And you two you were amazing tonight, and you reflected beautifully. And I hope as we share this message promotes the reconciliation and healing that I personally want to see in our country, Joanne, and also in your country, my other country, Gerald. So I hope that this is what we've accomplished tonight. And thank you both very much for making this time. I'm very, very appreciative of it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Michelle.
You're welcome. And good night, Gerald. Good morning to you still. Enjoy your next meeting. God bless. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, Gerald.
Bye, Gerald. Bye,
Bye,
Joanne.
Mish. Thank you
Bye.
so much. Bye.